So let me start by thanking the organizers for having me here today, and to all of you for coming on the chilliest day in May to spend your Friday afternoon. And so I will try to be brief, but I see a lot of themes and overlaps already between what I was going to present and what has already been discussed. And so let me start by saying that my presentation is going to try and answer, and it will only ever be a partial answer, to George's final question: when when and what is the post-colonial? So the title of this talk today is Number in the Post-Colonial Imagination. And it is a play off of a really well-known 1993 article by the anthropologist Arjuna Padurai that is called Number in the Colonial Imagination. And it tries to pick up a little bit on where George left us off, which is to try and think about both the shifts from colonial practices of enumeration to post-colonial ones, but also the enduring legacies of the colonial period. And in the process, part of my work, what it's trying to do is to re-examine a now slightly older but still very foundational set of literatures in the domain of anthropology, politics, sociology of South Asia, that a lot of work developed in the 1970s, 1980s, into the 1990s that looked at the politics of colonial knowledge practices. And some of that, foundational work, which you see, for instance, in the writings of James Scott, who in the 1990s came out with a book that was a kind of culmination of years of work called Seeing Like the State. And in that book, Scott argues that there are ways in which the state in particular, in its projects of enumeration and surveillance, tries to see in a totalizing top-down fashion, but fundamentally misses and fails to recognize the complexity of reality on the ground. And that has, he argues very effectively, disastrous results in countless 20th century practices of these big schemes of development, the building of big dams, the planning of the post-independence economy, that many of these schemes that were meant to improve the human condition of post-colonial citizens in fact fail, and they fail because the state, in its practices, of which enumeration and classification are central, is unequipped to understand diversity and complexity. And for many of us, that was really very foundational. But what I'm trying to do is to both kind of take that as an important starting point, but also to push against it, to think more in a more challenging way about the politics of both being seen and not seen, especially through the practices of the state. So I would like to start with this very poignant and, to me, deeply affecting slide, which is was coming out of numbers produced very recently from India's current COVID wave, which has just been catastrophic. So what you see on the left-hand side of this slide are a number of bar graphs that are trying to compare reported deaths in various places, comparing them to the number of cremations. This is data that was recently published in the Financial Times, and it shows us something absolutely shocking, which is to say that official numbers about COVID deaths in India, which are based largely on hospital deaths and those who tested positive, as opposed to all of the people who never made it to hospital or whose deaths were never formally attested to, that if you look at the number of recent cremations in comparison to certified COVID-related deaths, you see a massive discrepancy across the board, but in some places as high as 24 times higher than the official numbers. And where are they getting this? They're getting this from these kinds of images. So what people are doing they're basically analyzing these kinds of images, looking in a top-down manner literally, at cremations. This is a cremation ground outside of Delhi. And it is, as you can see there, you can just imagine what the politics of making visible look like there. Because on the one hand, to not be counted is to not count, and to not be represented in an accurate account of both what is happening and who is being most, acutely affected. On the other hand, to make visible is to, as we can see, to intrude on some of the most painful moments. And so there's been quite a bit of debate about whether this kind of picture on the right is voyeurism, but many have argued that these kinds of pictures on the right are incredibly important in the context in which the records of the state are neither accurate nor transparent, and what we need is to actually count people, right, and to include them. So to be counted, is that a necessary form of political inclusion? Is that surveillance? Is it both? And so that is the kind of tension I would like to kind of maintain for the rest of my talk. So let's see, sorry, I'm trying to navigate this. So I'm going to structure the presentation in 3 parts. One looks very generally at the history, a brief history of measurement and measuring forms of social inequality. The second part looks at enumeration in colonial India, much of which I can keep very short because George has already given us a fantastic account. And a final bit about the rise of statistical sampling in post-colonial India. So this is the first part. So in the 19th century, across the board, you see a massive explosion of the availability of data, especially data that is available to and through state organizations, though that is not exclusively the case. But what we find in the 19th century is that population figures, births and deaths, right, become the most significant data that is available. But we also have new forms of data coming through institutions, schools, factories, very importantly, prisons, insane asylums. And much of what is being gathered there is the measurement of bodies. So for instance, the precursor of statistical tools like BMI as a way of thinking about bodily health, or at least bodily, population averages in terms of height and weight, but also things like caloric needs. A lot of those statistics are created by measuring and monitoring prisoners, both in the UK, but in many other parts of the world at the same time. So the measurement of bodies, of births and deaths, but heights and weights and caloric needs, these things become kind of centrally the data that serves as the foundation of state statistics. And in the process, because these institutions that we find, these that are central to data gathering, are also about, not obviously, not coincidentally, but fundamentally about disciplining, as Foucault tells us, all of the different ways in which human activity can appear deviant. So workhouses, asylums, prisons, etc. A lot of poverty and inequality are attributed to behavioral problems, drunkenness, shiftlessness, vagrancy, and so forth. And this is also the period from about 1841 onwards, when the decennial census becomes a kind of central technology of data gathering in the UK. And it comes to India roughly around that same time, around 1851, but becomes much more central and, well, it becomes a kind of centralized project that is far more ambitious in its scope in around 1871. At the same time, in around the 1830s, you see the rise of modern social statistics. Here on the left-hand side, you see Adolf Quetelet, Belgian statistician, who famously took techniques used to measure and chart planetary movement and applied those same techniques to the understanding of large-scale human phenomena. And in the process, came to develop and show something that is now, so incredibly commonplace, but at the time was absolutely kind of unprecedented. And so what he shows is that there is a law of large numbers, as people came to argue, that when you have a large enough data set, and you're charting births, deaths, but also, criminality or other social behaviors, what you find is that they are distributed along a normal or a bell curve. And this has a number of kind of very important effects. One is to argue that that social behavior is not actually simply about individual moral flaws of shiftlessness or drunkenness or other kinds of personal moral failings, but rather that there is a kind of social systemic distribution of these phenomena. And it actually produces a very conservative social policy that says that actually there's very little the state can do or social reformers can do to shift these phenomena significantly, because they are going to have a bell-shaped distribution over time. Similarly, it comes to have a kind of, from the very beginning, and this is well documented by historians like John Carson, this phenomena embeds in modern statistical practice normative claims that both reinforce statistical practice, but also exceed it into social practices. And by that, I mean that the idea of the normal versus the deviant or the abnormal is embedded right into our statistical practices. And this was observed even at the time, so that there were certain kinds of things that one wanted to be normal, right? So it was, you want to be normal when it comes to things like height and weight, let's say, right? As opposed to abnormal. But do you want to have, average intelligence? And so what it starts to do is to actually shift the social discourse towards various ways of thinking about what is desirable and what kind of, to place individuals into that larger social distribution, to weigh the individual versus against a larger social backdrop. And then finally, at the end of the 19th century, you have Charles Booth's famous surveys of London. I'm sure that everyone here is incredibly familiar with these. But what I want to just say about these, and if you're less familiar and you want to see more about them, the LSE has digitized a lot of the underlying material and all of these amazing maps of the City of London. So Booth and his surveyors produce quite a number of precedents in terms of the social survey as a methodology, but also the kind of relationship between quantitative and qualitative data gathering, as well as the relationship between enumeration and classification. And in the process, what you start to see are that rather than either thinking of poverty as embedded fundamentally in individual moral failings, or kind of developed through social phenomena that are not easily shiftable, what you start to see both through the maps and through the kind of larger survey project is that poverty and disparity appear far more structural, and that those structures are things that social policy can actually target. So if you look at the categories of the coding here, I will just say that what you see in these categories are a kind of mixture of causation. So the lowest class, which is Black, is vicious and semi-criminal. Whereas over here, we have a class that is poor, understood maybe in terms of both kind of money, but also material goods. And then up here, we have things that say material class, well-to-do, upper middle, and upper classes wealthy. And so what we have is a mixture of, categories that go from behavior to economic condition to social status. And so, it's a way of showing us that our categories are quite hybrid, and they remain that way from this early moment onwards. So this serves as a kind of backdrop to a larger argument that is, attempting to do two things. So we see this explosion of numbers and their centrality to governance in the state throughout the 19th century, and the colonial context is not excluded from that, is centrally, a part of that. However, there are certain ways in which enumeration in the colonial context is different. And this is the argument that Ajahn Upadhyay makes in his 1993 article. So what Ajahn is saying is that a couple of things. Well, first of all, even about the earlier presentation, that is a kind of generalized account of the 19th century, enumeration and classification go hand in hand. So that at every moment that you are seeing these projects of quantification, you are also seeing the construction of social categories. In the context of the UK, in the context of Britain in the 19th century, a lot of the effort and the focus, as we've already heard from the first panels, from Marion's presentation, is a kind of focus on the poor, or those who are seen as the direct objects of potential social intervention. In the context of the colony, that includes the entire population. So that who is considered problematic or in need of intervention, and rather than being a subset, it is the entire population. So these projects of enumeration in the colonial context come to be ones that have a totalizing aspiration. And the second, and this is a kind of distinction not only between the difference between metropolitan and colonial enumeration, but also between colonial enumeration and projects of enumeration and the state that, preceded it, is that in the context of colonial India, for instance, generating numbers, generating data was a way of not simply administering a territory. So the Mughals, for instance, had collected vast amounts of data, mostly on land revenue and taxation. And the British inherited and expanded on much of that existing system of collecting data on land and taxes. However, in the kind of 19th century, in the colonial context, this data was not simply a way of administering land taxes. It becomes a way of exerting supremacy by claiming to have a totalizing understanding or knowledge of the colonial context. So data becomes not just a means to an administrative end, it becomes an end in itself that serves, that the knowledge projects of the colonial state are central to its claims to know, to govern, to have power, to have efficacy over both the territory and the people of, in the context I'm looking at colonial India. So what you see are a number of different, these are some images from the Trigonometric Survey, and it got blurred, but some of the maps that are produced by the Trigonometric Survey in the first half of the 19th century. And many of the people who are involved in this project are incredibly proud of trying to say that all of the knowledge that had existed in terms of surveys of territory or censuses in terms of population or records of archaeological sites, that all of these had been kind of very piecemeal in the pre-colonial context. And what the British were going to do was, in this kind of Borgesian way, produce a total map, a complete account of both the territory and all of the social phenomena, so that everything would rightly be finally put in a place in an encyclopedic fashion.
Poornima, I'm so sorry. Could I ask you to wrap up in the next minute or two?
Sure.
Okay, that would be great. Thanks so much.
So, okay, so let me, sorry, I didn't realize I was going quite so over. I wasn't looking at the time. Okay, so so this is what if those are the aspirations of the colonial census, the post-colonial information regime is quite different. And what it tries to do is that rather than mapping both territory and population through things like the caste census, as we see through George's work, the colonial sampling surveys attempt instead to look at, through consumption of the material practices and levels of living of everyday people. And so India in the 1950s becomes a site of innovation where you see for the first time the development of large-scale sampling. So sampling had existed on a very small scale prior to the 1950s. And P.C. Mahalanobis, who you see on the left-hand side, is absolutely crucial for the development from the 1930s through the 1950s of a series of experiments that try to put, again, everything in its place by creating by using household budget surveys to produce crucial data for national income accounts. But he does this not by surveying everybody, but by representative sampling. And so it was imagined, many people thought this could not be done, because what would be a representative sample for, at the time, a population of 360 million people? And it was thought that it couldn't be done. So the crucial shift in colonial enumeration to post-colonial enumeration is that post-colonial enumeration becomes foundationally more stochastic and probabilistic. We saw that lovely little image in Marion's presentation of all that, the kind of iceberg that lies underneath. And so the argument was that the post-colonial state, unlike the colonial state, would be able to produce data, not every 10 years, but every 6 months on occupation, health, education, but fundamentally on consumption. And that this constant access to data would be a kind of techno-futurist foundation for creating a planned democratic state. And in the process, it teaches people new categories. So if the census taught people categories of identity, the sample survey teaches people categories of consumption. So what is consumption versus savings? How to kind of think about your monthly budget expenditure so that you track everything from housing to consumer durables to food and clothing. So they'd have these exhaustive lists that they would take from house to house and go back every 6 months to teach them how to kind of categorize their own expenditure. And in the process, Mahalanobis hoped that this would be, so I don't have time to kind of explain what this slide is saying, but that this would be a way of shifting the political discourse from identities and communities, where political representation is about what kind of community you belong to. But instead of thinking about representation of Hindus and Muslims and caste categories in the context of India, instead inclusion would be on a material basis of consumption, that if we could raise consumption levels across the population, that would be a practice of a democratic state. And so I will just leave by saying that obviously this is highly contested, but it means, for instance, that the Indian state kept copious records of people's consumption from the 1950s onwards. It did not conduct a caste survey after 1931, and only does so again in 2011, but then the results of the caste survey was not made public. So caste actually disappears as a category of enumeration in the official census, and what comes to be central is consumption. And it creates new boundaries of what it means to be visible and invisible, both of which are contested. As you can see from George's presentation, that has made the discrimination of caste less visible. And that has had terrible consequences in terms of trying to create equality and trying to overcome centuries of caste discrimination. But it has also brought the consumer citizen as a fundamental part of the political discourse in the context of India, so that what the state provides are access to kind of major consumer items like food and fuel, even though in this current context, it is even failing to bring oxygen to people. But consumption becomes a kind of category of inclusion. So this is all just a way of saying that rather than simply thinking of the state as failing or accurately portraying the phenomena that it studies, there's a more complicated way in which numbers and the lived realities that they represent are co-produced. And I think that kind of pushes us beyond a kind of politics of authenticity or transparency or accuracy when it comes to what it means to count people.